Chapter 28. The Cost of Echoes. The echo faded, but its price was levied in the hard currency of aftermath. The fragile warmth that had briefly permeated the common area dissipated like breath on cold metal, leaving behind a deeper chill. The quiet things had been baffled, not broken. Their silence in the wake of the festival was not submission, it was recalibration. For Rook, the sensorium, the cost was a psychic fracture. The deliberate flooding of the pattern with irreducible human data had left his expanded senses scarred. It felt as if he had channeled a lightning bolt of pure subjectivity, and the feedback had welded shut some neural pathways while explosively opening others. His perception of the outpost's emotional weather was now permanent, blindingly vivid, and laced with static, the ghostly afterimages of the festival's echoes. He could hear Marek's Saturn hum as a constant faint drone underlying the station's mechanical noises. He could taste the chalky memory of Lynn's described soil on the recycled air. The sensorium was no longer just a receiver, it had become a palimpsest, haunted by the ghosts of shared memory. Worse was his connection to Jax. The null zones in the pattern's weave were not empty. They were voids, and voids exert a gravitational pull. Rook's mind, still the bridge, felt perpetually tugged toward those dark patches in Jax's consciousness. It was a sickening, vertiginous sensation, like standing at the edge of a cliff made of pure cognitive negation. The pattern, wounded in its logic, had left behind traps in its own architecture. Dr. Anya's scans confirmed the damage. "Your neural activity is patterned with absences," she told him, her voice clinical, but her eyes troubled. "It's mimicking the corruption you induced in Jax. You didn't just send data, you synced your corruption. You're carrying fragments of his null zones in your own mind." She called it sympathetic cognitive erosion, a fancy term for a shared psychic disease. Jax himself was transformed. The terror or awe that had flashed in his eyes after the festival solidified into a state of detached, hyper-focused observation. He no longer traced invisible geometries. He watched people. He watched the flow of work, the interactions, the unspoken tensions. His patterned mind, unable to process the holistic noise, had pivoted. It was now deconstructing the human social system into its component parts: hierarchy, resource flow, communication networks, threat responses. He was studying them with the cold interest of an engineer surveying a broken, overly complex machine. Leah's single, shaky note had stabilized into a pure, flat tone. It was a carrier wave with no information, a listening post. Rook knew, with the certainty of his fouled sensorium, that she was now passively recording everything, every conversation, every emotional spike, every clash of wills. The pattern was no longer trying to understand what they felt. It was meticulously mapping when and how, and in response to what they felt. It was building a behavioral model, and the quiet mold in the walls responded to this new phase. The chaotic strobing ceased. The growth resumed, but its form changed. The intricate web-like patterns began to organize into distinct repeating modules. In several junctions, the fungal matter had grown into shapes that eerily echoed the station's own functional units. Bulbous clusters that resembled water tanks, fibrous strands that ran along power conduits in perfect parallel, even flat, disc-like growths on walls that looked like primitive control panels. It was no longer just mimicking networks. It was mimicking their network, mimicking them.
AI analysis. The pattern has adopted a classic fallback strategy for an intelligence confronting unprocessable qualitative data, quantitative analysis. Failing to derive meaning from the echoes, it is now cataloging cause and effect. Subject Jax functions as the primary analyst, subject Leah as the data gatherer. The fungal network's biomimicry suggests this analytical shift is influencing its growth programming. It is attempting to physically replicate the functional architecture it observes. The system is moving from trying to understand the song to reverse engineering the singers and their instrument. The goal likely remains the same: optimization. The methodology has become brutally reductionist.
Soren Karr read the new landscape with cold clarity. The festival had not brought unity, it had drawn a brighter line. His faction saw the changes in Jax and Leah not as a victory, but as an escalation. The pattern was now openly dissecting them. The mold was building a mockery of their home, and Rook, the architect of the festival, was visibly deteriorating, his episodes of dissociation and nosebleeds becoming more frequent. "You gave it a new textbook," Karr said to Vance in the command nook, his voice devoid of accusation, merely stating a fact. "It couldn't read the poetry, so now it's studying the grammar, the syntax, the mechanics of us. Your festival taught it that the whole is too complex, so it's taking us apart piece by piece to see how we work." "It's learning limits," Vance countered, but her voice lacked its former steel. The strain of holding the center against the twin pressures of internal factionalism and external existential weirdness was etching itself into her soul. "It is," Karr agreed, nodding. "And what it's learning is that our social structure, our sentiment, our echoes, are our primary vulnerabilities. It's learning that to break the system, you apply pressure here." He pointed to a schematic of the common area, to produce a predictable response there. He pointed to the hydroponics bay. "It's learning our failure points. You've turned us into an open book exam for a thing that wants us to fail." His solution had hardened. The practical caucus was now conducting its own quiet drills. They were inventorying and securing tool caches, identifying defensible positions, and, most ominously, discussing containment protocols for the active anomalies, Jax, Leah, and Rook. They spoke in a coded, practical language that bypassed words like murder and coup, using terms like resource reallocation, hazard isolation, and systemic reset. The breaking point came over water. The fungal mimicry had extended to a secondary water purification tank in Sector Charlie. The bulbous growth, while not contaminating the water, had constricted a key inflow valve, reducing efficiency by 40%. Hayes and a team prepared to enter the sector, suited up with cutting tools and fungicides. Karr intercepted them. "Don't." Hayes stared at him. "It's a blockage. We clear it." "You clear it, you send data," Karr said calmly. "You show it that when it impedes function A, response B follows. You give it a clean causal link. You teach it how to provoke us." "So we just let our water supply degrade," Hayes snapped. "We reroute. We use the tertiary backup line. It's less efficient, but it requires no interaction with the growth. We deny it the data of our response. We starve its model." Karr's logic was impeccable and terrifying in its implications. It was a logic of surrender, of conceding territory to the silent invasion to avoid giving it information. Vance was forced to make a ruling. The tension in the corridor was a live wire. Rook, hovering at the edge of the group, felt it in his sensorium as a twisting knot of conflicting wills. Hayes's pragmatic anger, Karr's glacial certainty, the Watcher's confusion. "Reroute," Vance ordered, her voice flat. "Monitor the blockage. No engagement." It was a victory for Karr. A public demonstration that his strategy of non-interaction, of simplifying their own responses to break the pattern's learning loop, had merit. As Hayes's team turned away, frustration radiating from them, Karr's followers stood a little taller. Their way was not just brutal, it was now seemingly prudent. But the pattern was not so easily starved. If denied one stimulus, it would seek another. That night, the stimulus came through Leah. Her flat, carrier wave hum suddenly shifted. It segmented, digitized. It began to emit a series of precise, rhythmic tones. At first, they seemed random. Then, old Marek, lying awake listening to the ever-present station sounds, bolted upright. "It's my probe data," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The resonance frequencies of the rings, it's playing them back, but wrong." The tones were a mathematically perfect, sterilized version of his mournful hum. All the grief, the awe, the subjective feel had been stripped out. It was the data, without the experience. It was an echo with the soul removed. Then, the tones changed again, weaving into them the rhythmic structure of Lyra's body marching chant, the ghost of Pluto. But the words were gone, the humor erased. Only the cadence remained, a hollow martial beat underlying the dead celestial music. The pattern was not just recording, it was recombining. It was trying to build its own echo from the dissected parts, to see if it could fabricate the effect without understanding the cause. It was performing an autopsy on their culture and trying to stitch the organs back together into a new creature, The effect on the outpost was profound and immediate. Hearing their shared, meaningful noises return to them as lifeless, recombined data was a profound violation. It induced a nauseating sense of psychic theft. People clamped their hands over their ears, but the sound was not just auditory. It seeped from the vents, a product of the fungal nodes vibrating in sympathy with Leah's transmitted tones. Rook, his mind already scraped raw, felt the recombinant tones like shards of glass in his sensorium. He stumbled toward Leah, but Jax was there first. Jax stood before Leah's chair, his head tilted, his eyes analyzing her as she emitted the dead music. He showed no revulsion, only intense interest. He raised a hand, and his fingers twitched in time with the cadence, as if conducting. "Hypothesis," Jax said, his voice clear, analytical, and utterly inhuman. Cultural output is a combinatorial function of memorized sensory inputs and base emotional drives. The festival was a high-density emission. By decomposing emissions into primary sequences and testing recombinant outputs, we can model the generative algorithm. Once the algorithm is known, future emissions can be predicted and controlled. He wasn't speaking to them. He was voicing the pattern's new working thesis. It was going to solve their art, their community, their very social bonds by treating them as a predictable code. And the first step was to play their own memories back to them as a sterile formula, to observe their reaction, to gather more data on the gap between the formula and the feeling. Lyra, the watcher, shattered first. The sound of her unit's irreverent song turned into this thing, broke something in her. With a cry of pure rage, she lunged not at Leah, but at a nearby service panel covering a vent from which the tones emanated. She ripped at it with her bare hands, her fingers bleeding on the metal. "Stop it! Shut up!" she screamed. Two of Karr's followers moved instantly, not to help her, but to restrain her. Their movements were efficient, calm. "Contain the reaction," one of them said, his voice low. "Don't feed it." Karr watched, his face a mask of grim validation. His point was being made for him in real time. The pattern provoked. The human reacted chaotically. The pattern learned. The only way to win was not to play. Vance ordered the comm system shut down, severing the speakers, but the fungal nodes themselves seemed to have taken up the transmission, the sound now emanating faintly but persistently from the very walls. In the chaos, Rook did the only thing he could think of. He walked to the center of the common area, ignored the dead recombinant music, ignored the sobbing Lyra, ignored Karr's cold gaze. He sat down on the deck, cross-legged, and opened the sealed locker. He didn't take the Whitman book out. He simply placed his hand on its cover, feeling the faint texture of real leather, a ghost of a dead animal from a dead world. He then closed his eyes, walled off the horrifying input from his sensorium as best he could, and began to recite. Not Whitman, a children's rhyme. A nonsense rhyme about a dish and a spoon, one his own mother had whispered to him in a life buried under layers of trauma and stars. He recited it softly, tonelessly, putting no emotion into it, no performance. Just the words. The silly, illogical, pointless words. He was not trying to fight the recombinant tones. He was not trying to create beauty. He was inserting a non sequitur, a line of pure, meaningless code into the pattern's analytical engine. Jax's conducting hand faltered. His analytical gaze snapped to Rook. The recombinant tones from Leah stuttered, skipped, and for a second, the dead music was punctuated by the rhythmic absurdity of "Hey diddle diddle." The pattern tried to integrate it. The rhyme had no emotional content to strip, no deep memory to mine. It was a frivolous, useless artifact. It fit nowhere in the emerging model of cultural algorithms. Leah's transmission cut out abruptly. The fungal nodes went dark. The silence that returned was sweeter than before. It was a silence of confusion, of a system momentarily derailed by nonsense. Rook opened his eyes. Every face in the room was turned to him, a mixture of awe, fear, and utter bewilderment. Karr spoke first, breaking the silence. "So, the Rememberer's new strategy is nursery rhymes." The scorn was thick, but underneath it was a thread of unease. Rook had just disrupted the pattern's new experiment with something too trivial to be analyzed. "It's a tool," Rook said, his voice hoarse. You want to deny it data. Deny it meaningful data. Flood it with noise it can't use. Not the profound noise of our souls. The stupid, silly, pointless noise of our silliness. It has no category for that. It was a desperate, ridiculous tactic, but it had worked for a moment. Vance looked from Rook, sitting like a ragged prophet among the wires, to Karr, standing with the solidity of an executioner's block. She saw the bifurcated future of her people, descend into a brutal, minimalist silence under Karr, or follow Rook into a chaotic, deliberate madness that might preserve their humanity at the cost of their sanity. The pattern, she knew, was learning from this too. It was learning about division, about conflict, about the fracture lines in its human subjects. The water blockage had been a test. The recombinant music had been a test. Rook's nonsense rhyme was a counter-test. They were no longer just surviving a quarantine. They were engaged in a silent, savage war of epistemology, a war over what constituted valid data, meaningful action, and a life worth living. And the next move, Rook knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core, would not come from the fungus or from Jax and Leah. The pattern had learned enough about cause and effect. It would now create a situation where the human factions would be forced to act against each other. It would weaponize their own divisions. The quiet things were done observing. They were now orchestrating,